Welcome, Pilar Jennings, and thanks for joining us at the Seekers Forum.
Thank you, Mark. I'm happy to be here with you.
Thanks. At the beginning of your last book, To Heal a Wounded Heart, you wrote, "Before I became a therapist, I worried that listening to people wade through their arcane and tortured histories would leave me feeling dreadfully, even dangerously enervated." How did that not happen for you?
It's a great question. Yeah, it was a real fear for me, and it was one of the obstacles that I had to overcome to be willing to train and enter the field because I think I was so accustomed to trying to open my mind and my heart when I was with another person before I became a clinician. And like a lot of people who are empathic or they veer in that direction characterologically, I was aware that I would end up carrying quite a lot of feeling and story and history. And then I think through a combination of training and through maturing and through trusting that people have their own resources to help them hold their difficult stories, it became easier to really show up, hear a lot, but without feeling like it was mine alone to carry.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Let's talk about the case in To Heal a Wounded Heart, Martine, this young girl that you worked with, and how it is that you brought Lama Pema in to sit with those sessions and how that changed the dynamic. What did you learn about deep listening from him?
Mm. Well, so Kempo Pema, at that time known as Lama Pema, was and remains my Buddhist teacher and beloved spiritual friend and just all around wonderful human being. And throughout our friendship, because I'm a nosy person and because I was actively training to become a psychoanalyst, I was asking him a lot about his history. And so he was sharing with me his own enormous suffering as a child. And I was struck by the fact that he could listen to himself. He seemed to be very reflective about what he had lived through, even though he shared with me that he hadn't known what he lived through would be considered traumatic because that language didn't exist for him. And so, as I was working with Martine, who was my first patient, and she was a little girl who had lived through a whole lot, so much so that she stopped talking.
Give us a little bit of a background on Martine.
Yeah, she was just a wonderful, funny, highly intelligent kid who, in many ways, was doing beautifully in life, but had suffered a lot of loss. She had a mother who suffered from chronic addiction, and so the mother would come and go, which, as we know, is tough when we're young to sometimes see a needed parent and then they disappear and then they suddenly come back. Everything is so uncertain and chaotic. She was fortunate because she had a really dedicated grandparent who ended up raising her and wonderful sibling. But there were many other deaths in the family. Um, and so she was just dealing with chronic loss. And my sense is that she found an excellent way to cope, which was to stop letting people know that it was too much and just try to bear it on her own, right? Which is a good way of defending against counting on other people only to find that they don't show up. So when we began working together, she very rarely spoke. And that was challenging in all sorts of ways. Excuse me, in part because I had been training to actively listen to people talk a lot. And so I had to start to augment my understanding of what it means to listen. right? And what am I listening for? And I had a sense through knowing Lama Pema and through my conversations and supervision and clinical supervision that he might be able to come in and help me listen in more creative ways and help Martine feel more understood.
And how did that happen? Can you give us a sense of how that process unfolded?
Yeah, so I really took my time, especially in supervision, to just think through the implications for bringing anybody else into a treatment. Because part of what we try to do as therapists is create a condition that feels really safe, contained, predictable. Not boring, hopefully, but pretty predictable and reliable. So I really wanted to think through what this could be like for Martine. And in my friendship with Lama Pema, I was just coming to know such a gentle, non-threatening, down-to-earth person who also is very funny like a child, giddy and spontaneous and quirky. I just sensed that he'd be a really benign presence, but also playful. And I did run groups for children, so I knew how helpful it could be for a child to have another kid there, even if they're a slightly bigger kid, and feel like there's not too much attention on them. Even for adult patients, sometimes that attention feels a little burdensome. So I made the decision with my supervisor's approval to invite him, and it was extremely sweet. Martine really seemed to enjoy it. She was very responsive. She even spoke in that first session, not a lot, but she spoke, which was huge. And so I just sensed the potential there.
Mm-hmm. And how long did that go on, that therapy with Martine, with Pema, Lama Pema?
Off and on for about a year. Yeah.
And then did you continue to see her without him?
I did, yes.
And how is she today? Do you know?
I don't know. And so I hope that she's well and safe. Yes, and I, of course, would love to know.
Yes. So I'd like to talk about what you learned from Lama Pema about deep listening and about deep listening as a spiritual practice in general. You know, of course, it runs through traditions, through Buddhism, through Native American tradition, that sacred art of listening. Can you say something about how you've grown, how you've matured in this area of being able to listen deeply and empathically?
Well, one of the reasons why I think I was drawn to both an analytic modality and Buddhist spirituality is that the traditions really have in common the primary need to listen deeply, listen with an open mind, to not be too attached to agendas or theories or perspectives. There's a certain reverence to having a spacious, open mind that is going to be beneficial for another human being. And while the modalities are really different around how listening is used, interestingly, in both traditions, that's really a primary modality. Right? Rather than working with, in clinical work, we're not working with medicines, we're not working with behavioral techniques, we're really working with our minds. And what I have sensed and discovered over time is that in the Buddhist tradition, there are just many, many more methods for cultivating the ability to listen deeply than you find in psychoanalysis or psychotherapy.
Can you say more?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, in a way, what is presumed is that when people train to become psychotherapists, they will be able to listen carefully and with humility. But of course, we all bring our stuff to our clinical work. We bring our histories, we bring our traumas. Because we're human beings, many therapists are currently going through real difficulties and stressors. And there really aren't methods in psychotherapeutic training for deep listening. But in Buddhist spirituality, there are countless methods. And so one of the things that many Buddhist clinicians have found is that it's a needed gift that one finds in Buddhism for clinical work, to be able to ground the mind and to help settle stuff that is riling the mind, and to contact some curiosity, some compassion, even if we notice aversion or biases. Yeah.
Are there any methods in the Buddhist tradition for deep listening that specific methods that you could talk about?
I would say a primary method is mindfulness and the four scopes of mindfulness, which is really about internal listening, but of course all listening is internal, right? And then we offer it to others. But with mindfulness, we're basically developing the ability to notice what's happening in the mind in real time, optimally with as little judgment as possible, so that it doesn't feel embarrassing or humiliating to notice how chaotic our minds might be, or how the mind is always getting pulled to some weird place, even though we're presenting as very calm. And then over time, really, really being able to sustain that awareness. And interpersonally, this is incredibly helpful, because I notice, sadly, sometimes with a patient, they're telling me something that matters hugely, but my mind has suddenly gone to something that happened to me that morning, or what I'm going to be doing that night, or what I want for dinner. I mean, sometimes it's not especially important stuff. So mindfulness practice has been very helpful, just to notice that and to be able to come back. Yeah.
Do patients notice when your mind has wandered? Have you ever been called on that by a patient?
No one has ever, well, maybe someone has said something along the lines of, this doesn't happen often, but I'm sure someone has said, am I boring you, or something.
Right.
Something. Yeah.
I remember going to my own therapist, my beloved therapist for years, one day, and she seemed so tired. I was feeling terrible that I had gotten her up early or something to come to the office, and
Yeah.
the whole session I was in her head. I was worried about her, which is
Yes.
obviously counterproductive in therapy.
Right.
And I just wondered, as a therapist, whether you get that kind of mirroring from patients very often, but it sounds like not.
I mean, patients have expressed every concern under the sun, because part of what can happen, as you know, is a real relationship is forming, and hopefully with love and affection and concern, all the ingredients we want in any intimate relationship, intimate and boundaried. And so patients have asked me if I'm really okay, and of course sometimes when there have been things going on in my personal life that require me to cancel or reschedule a session, I've needed to let them know. If I have a family member who's undergoing a procedure and then they worry. Yeah.
What is it about being witnessed and being seen and being heard that is so healing? How does that heal one in pain?
Yeah. This is a critically important question because it's a basic human ingredient to be seen, right, to feel recognized. And some of the early developmental and analytic researchers like Renee Spitz and then John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, and then in recent years Beatrice Beebe and now Jessica Benjamin and others, they've all talked about how our physical needs being met is simply not enough to sustain genuine well-being, that infants need that experience of knowing they're being recognized by someone they're seeing. And babies who are perfectly well cared for in terms of food and climate controlled environments, etc., if they suffer the deprivation of that emotional nourishment of being seen in a way that helps them feel safe, helps them feel loved, helps them feel real, they will wither and sometimes they won't survive. It's that critically needed. And what's sometimes not understood is that that's a need that continues throughout the life cycle. It's a need we have until the last breath. And so in healing work, and this is especially true of psychotherapy or psychoanalysis, is people really need to feel that they can be seen in a way that matches how they authentically see themselves, right? That someone is not just going to project their narrative onto them about who they are or who they should be, but that they can finally come into view and still be treated with respect and affection and love. Yeah.
It's so interesting what you're saying about being seen by another the way they see themselves.
Yes.
Yeah, I haven't thought of that before, because we all so often feel like we are, as you say, we're either there's either projection, or we're somehow a reflection of the other, what the other person's beliefs are, or they're trying to change us in some way. But is that important too, for the person to know you're not trying to change them in any way, that there's no control involved?
Yeah, it's hugely important, right? Because when we feel controlled by another, then it does eclipse that room that's needed to feel like we get to be who we authentically are. And one of the central reasons why people come into therapy is because they just have not had that room interpersonally or enough of it, or because of who they are or the body they're in or their circumstances, they still can't get that room in the larger culture. So it's very important to feel that with the therapist is not trying to mold them in some way, or even radically change the course of their life. Even if in theory it would be helpful, still they need to feel met and understood as they are.
And how does this discipline of deep listening affect trauma treatment in particular? Does trauma present particular challenges to you as a clinician, deep trauma, that deep listening addresses?
Yes to both. I mean, I would suggest that probably most people have experienced trauma, because trauma is basically any experience that overwhelms our consolidated ability to cope. So it's very easy to find oneself in a situation, especially in childhood, where we're facing something that we haven't yet developed skills to recover from. Now, of course, not everybody is severely traumatized, and many people are. And it does present particular challenges because one symptom of severe trauma is the sense of being wrenched away from the world, right? Separated out from the social world. And so it can leave people feeling radically alone or almost intractably alone. So if they're with someone who is listening in a way that is non-threatening, gentle, attuned, non-coercive, then it can start to create the conditions that help someone feel fundamentally safer, and it can help them feel like they get to rejoin the world. They get to be with another human being safely. And that can obviously begin to facilitate real healing.
And deep listening is more than just hearing the words.
Yeah.
Right. Deep listening is an embodied practice.
Yes.
Can you say something about how you listen beyond the words?
Yeah, I love that question. I mean, listening listening, I would suggest, touches on all of our components, right? It touches on our psychology, our spirituality, our bodies. And as therapists, we do want to listen for the words because people need to feel specifically known. So we would try to listen to the specificity of what someone has lived through, right? Because we know, I mean, this is again why it's difficult when people are projecting their sense of who we are onto us. There's always some detail that really matters that doesn't get through.
Mm.
So skillful therapists are listening carefully, right? Both for what someone has lived through, but also their story about what they have lived through. And then we're listening also with our feeling realm, right? Just noticing what do we feel in response as we're hearing what someone is sharing. And then maybe even depending on someone's training or clinical orientation, noticing how those feelings might be an inroad to what someone else is experiencing, and maybe very privately. And it's helpful if we're also listening with our bodies, right? Because you mentioned when a therapist seems tired, like when their body is showing signs of fatigue, that is sometimes a reflection that their mind is not there. Mm-hmm. And it is true, sometimes therapists will suddenly feel very sleepy or even a little bit dissociated. And it's because they're struggling to stay with something they're hearing, or there's something going on with them in a particular patient. And in the very next session, the body will feel very energized and or connected or relaxed. And so, of course, Buddhist practice is helpful with this, to just notice what's happening in the body, right? And how might that be connected to how we're listening. Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about judgment. Someone I know who's a longtime meditator yesterday was saying to me that he finds that he doesn't know where discernment ends and judgment begins. And so while wanting to be discerning, he doesn't want to stand in judgment. And I wonder, as a therapist, when your job is discernment, if nothing else, what do you do with your own judgment when you're listening to things that disgust you or anger you or repulse you or make you want to laugh out loud? What does that what is that toggling process like for you?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's another great question. Something that I've noticed, Mark, in the work is that it's really esteem enhancing because it often brings out the best in a person. Right? So therapists might be very judgmental with their partners, their kids, basically everybody in their life, but somehow they're able to contain those judgments and try to show up with more open-hearted curiosity with a patient. And I have noticed this came up around politics, it's come up around all sorts of issues where I know I would have been highly reactive with any loved one if they had shared with me a point of view that a patient has shared.
Mm-hmm.
But because I do feel like it's my ethical duty to be discerning and to be curious and reflective with my patients, I have noticed at times, aversion, right? I think this point of view is going to cause harm to people. And so there is, I mean, I notice I can be very reactive around injustice. When I hear the perspective that just sounds like it's going to lead to injustice, there's a fiery part in me that just wants to say, no, like Manjushri's sword, let's cut through that. But with patients, I'll notice that I'll wait for it to settle. My Buddhist practice is helpful here. And then I'll try to wait until I can be genuinely more curious about what has led someone to believe something or to behave in a way that's harmful. It's possible. We can do it with anybody, but of course it's very hard to do with the people we depend on, the people we love. Not that I don't love my patients, I do.
No, I understand what you mean. So if we open it up a little bit and take it out of the therapy room,
Yeah.
how does an ordinary civilian in conversation with somebody who is expressing awful beliefs or beliefs that feel really destructive, how can we listen without judgment? Do you think it's possible?
Well, yes, I think it's possible. I know it's possible. I suppose another option is to cultivate a relationship to our judgments that's more skillful and less destructive. Right? I mean, I definitely have judgments toward all sorts of beliefs and behaviors. That doesn't mean that I have to act them out in a way that is then going to be destructive to the person who holds those beliefs. There's always a choice.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is a tough one. It's a tough one for most people, but it's definitely possible to speak truthfully, even if we're speaking a truth somebody doesn't want to hear, with respect, with compassion.
Mm-hmm. Meaning that if someone expresses something and that's anathema to you, you can respond honestly without attacking.
That's right. Even in a strong way, to say, my sense is, this belief is going to harm somebody. I mean, nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to hear that they're the person who's going to cause somebody else harm. Even, as Lama Pema says, even a mafioso, he doesn't want to hear that either. People who are obviously destructive don't want to hear that. Mm-hmm. It's possible, and the great clinicians do this beautifully. They speak hard truths, but they do it with a noble intention. They do it to try to illuminate something important. Yeah.
If you step back as a clinician and look at our culture, talking about American culture at the moment, do you see an inability to listen as being a major part of the reason we have so much of the conflict and irreconcilable difference that we have? If, in other words, if our culture were a patient of yours,
Yeah.
can you talk about how the role that listening or not listening plays?
Yes, yeah. I've thought about this quite a bit over the years. I mean, we've all been thinking about why we're in the predicament we're in. What I have noticed, Mark, is, and I'll just speak maybe for American culture writ large or Western cultures generally speaking, American culture is not a reflective culture. It is not a culture that privileges inner life and the ability to really notice what's happening internally. It's very externally oriented. And in that way, developmentally, it's not progressed even to adolescence,
Hmm.
right? I mean, it's a very young culture in terms of our ability to really think about our experience, to reflect, to notice, right, without acting out what arises internally. And it is my sense that this has been a huge issue that has led to all of our political problems, and it has been a huge factor in COVID. The inability to slow down, listen to what we're hearing, what we're learning about, and then make choices based on what we're learning that could reduce harm.
Mhm.
Instead, there was so much reactivity, right? Either about personalities or positions or politics that really interfered with that. You're calling it listening, I might call it learning, like learning and reflecting.
Mhm.
And if we can't listen and learn and reflect, when we're dealing with scary circumstances or radical change, we're probably going to be highly reactive. And and sadly, it does seem like that's what's happened.
Do you think the social media universe has also limited our ability to listen with any depth and focus?
Yes. Yes. I mean, I'm late in the game even to accept that there's something called the internet. There's something called social media that I have to deal with. Um, I think it's truly a mixed bag. I mean, obviously, during COVID, having social media, right, being able to interact the way we are now was an incredible blessing. But it also plays into our tendency to be reactive. And now, social scientists who have a lot of data are noticing the fallout, right? The fallout on children's development and early depression, largely about children having smartphones and access to social media, where they're dealing with all sorts of reactivity and they're getting very hurt by it. So I think we're going to need to learn a lot about how to use these tools in a non-harming way.
Right.
Yeah.
The connection between the ability to listen and hearing our own internal guidance.
Mm,
If we can't be present and tune in, we can't hear the still small voice within. It's not, it's lost in the din.
yes.
How can we practice being more attuned to our own inner guidance?
Mm. Yeah, I love this question. To me, it feels critically important, given what we were just talking about. I mean, we're all, or most of us, are probably really overstimulated much of the time. There's something always pulling at our attention, taking us away from inner life. And I do believe that we all have an incredibly effective intuitive capacity, right? We all have a voice that's imbued with wisdom and that has perspectives and feelings that need to be explored. So I would suggest that probably most people need some methods, right, to decompress, to unplug, to feel like we can do that without missing out on all the stuff that we have to be responsible for, in order to clear the space in the mind to just hear what's there, especially if it seems to go up against what we're being told by others or by people we we trust or people of authority, right? But it's an inner ballast. Without it, most people will feel a little unrooted,
Yeah.
especially with others.
How do we distinguish the voice of wisdom, that still small voice within, the voice of our intuition, from the voices of self-sabotage, the voices of bias, the voices of, how do we know the difference between those two things? Very often, obviously, the egotistical, for want of a better word, side it can masquerade as the truth. It's telling us this is the truth. This is what you need to do.
Mm-hmm.
How do we know? How can we understand the difference between those two kinds of guidance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question, right? Because I work with the notion that we all have many parts, many voices. We're all the ages we've ever been. So we have very young parts
Yeah.
that are often reactive, and they might be struggling to understand complex situations we're going through, and often they're very powerful. I suppose one way of discerning is, in my personal and clinical experience, if we're hearing a voice that is present day or even timeless, is a witnessing part, however you want to formulate that voice, that part, probably when we tap into it, we'll notice some feeling of relative safety or well-being, right? The system will settle. If it's another part that's either defensive or protective, right, probably will feel agitated in some way or contracted or overly excited. Right? So qualitatively, these voices, I think they impact us differently.
In my experience, there's a simplicity to the voice of intuition.
Yeah,
It doesn't lead to feeling confused or complicated.
right.
Suddenly, one sees the direct path between here and there, and where how we're moving and where we're being moved to.
Yeah.
It feels simple. It simplifies otherwise complicated situations as well.
Yeah, that rings true,
Yes, yeah.
right? Because so often when we're struggling with something, we feel tangled into a web, right? And then if we can tap into something wise internally, it is fairly direct, simple.
It's also, there's a difference between intuition and thinking. Those are
Mm-hmm.
not the same. Discursive thinking, deductive, reductive thinking is not the same as intuition. It's
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that I have loved about Buddhist spirituality is there is respect for our discursive mind. We do need to be able to think about our notion of reality and how we live and to analyze our experience. And we know in clinical work, this is also really important to be able to think about the truth of what we've lived through, who the key players really were, and why they behaved the way they did. I mean, we need our thinking caps to help us with that process. But in Buddhist spirituality, we try to marry that capacity with a more contemplative state, so that we learn or we think in a more spacious way. It's less about cracking the code or getting something right, and it's more about hearing, right, as you're describing, hearing a voice that has an important perspective, noticing more.
but it comes from that reflective practice. It comes from that foundation of self-awareness.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a doctor named Miriam Rose Ungerber Bauman, who's an Aboriginal clinician, who talks about the experience of dadiri, which is deep listening. And she says, when I experience dadiri, I am made whole again.
Mm.
To me, that points to why deep listening is a spiritual practice.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I mean, indigenous cultures have wisdom that is just deeply, sorely needed, right, in every culture, every contemporary culture. And often there are all of these practices, these methods, rituals, right, for deep listening, for presence, that probably does help people access a feeling of wholeness, whether it's an inner wholeness or a sense of being part of the natural world and not apart from it, separate from it. Yeah.
Because they have that tradition of the song lines, the trauma
Right.
lines that they follow, trauma, story, listening. They're all braided together in their spirituality.
Yes.
All about rejoining and reuniting and feeling part of the earth.
That's right. I just love it.
Me too.
Because yeah, right? It's also a way to convey that nothing has to be left out. Right? There's nothing about us that can't have a seat at the proverbial dinner table.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And that's what deep listening is about, right? We're saying you're saying to the person, I'm open to whatever you need to express. You don't have to leave anything out.
that's right.
That's such a relief. It's a it's a huge relief. Just one last question, Pilar. If you were to give a couple of pointers to people who have a lot of trouble listening, who really have difficulty attending, what
Mm-hmm.
are a few pieces of advice that you would give to such folks? Either direct practices, a shift of perspective.
Mm-hmm. Well, I suppose a place to start would be to take some time to just reflect on those struggles, right? Without any shame, without any judgment. If someone has the courage to notice that by other people's standards or their own, they're not a great listener, first of all, I really respect that because it means they're willing to just have a look at the truth of how they listen. And to be curious about what's contributed to the obstacles, right? Some people don't listen well because they've learned that the best way to stay safe is to try to dominate others, and including very lovely people who end up just becoming too dominant in conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So just to notice that could be very illuminating.
Mm-hmm.
Some people aren't great listeners because they didn't really ever have a relationship, maybe especially early in life, where there was much give and take, where there was any real turn taking. And so they don't have a feel for that rhythm. And so again, just to appreciate what's contributed to the difficulty, and then to experiment. If they notice that they either tend to dissociate a lot, so they're not actually hearing that much, or they're talking a lot in conversation or in a group, to imagine taking 5 minutes to interrupt that pattern gently and to do what might not come naturally and to say a little less and just notice what that feels like. Right? Notice what comes into view as a result.
Yeah, great. That's so helpful. Pilar, I so appreciate you taking the time. It's great to see you again.
It was a joy to be with you, Mark.
Thank you and be well. I can't wait for your next book.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, my dear.
Thanks, Mark.